So now let's understand the context in which you need to understand the Italian unification. So basically, Italy is even more unique when we talk about the basic history of Italy and how it was divided. Italy was actually under five different powers. So one part was with Austria, second part, a major part was with Spain, third with France, fourth with the Papal Church, or what we call the Papal Church area, which is the church itself used to control it, and fifth, which is the most important, which is a small area called Piedmont and Sardinia, which is called the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. Now, basically, this was the only state which was Italian and run by Italians. Here, you had four different powers which have different authority and different agendas. At the same time, what is more interesting is why there are five powers. Italy is also divided into North and South. Basically, North Italy is extremely urban, and with Milan, Genoa, Venice as areas, the fashion center of the world, and very, very prosperous. On the other hand, the point is that though they are very cosmopolitan, the problem with South Italy is it is totally agrarian. It has no literacy or very, very high illiterate population. At the same time, they are very, very Catholic Christian, pious Catholic Christians. So, which means that the church has a lot of authority over these population. So, basically, Italy culturally had two basic domains, which is that north of Italy, south of Italy. North is much more cosmopolitan and modern and the prosperous area. On the other hand, south is agrarian, backward, and over and above that, very, very staunch Catholics, along with high illiteracy. Now, the point is this: if it was not enough, five different powers are controlling them. So, when we talk about why didn't the Italians automatically come together? The answer is five different powers and north-south division. So now that we have context about what is the north-south division, why did it not automatically come under the rule of Italians? The basic point is we divide Italian unification into three phases, broadly based on the changing ideas. The point which you need to understand here is first that the first phase is in the pre-Napoleonic Risorgimento phase. And it's an important phase which is even before Napoleon captured Italy. And it's about resurgence and that is nothing but Risorgimento means resurgence, cultural movement. And that cultural movement is based on what? It is based on the concept that we want Italian identity to be formed. And it was a person called Alfieri who was very, very important, who made the Tuscany language, the Tuscanese language, as the language of what we call as Italian. So Italian language actually is a modified version of Tuscany language. On the other hand, this movement was very, very instrumental in creating cultural nationalism in the basic minds of the Italians. But though there is rise of cultural nationalism, remaining under five different powers would not help the fact that this cultural nationalism did not go anywhere. More than that, the Risorgimento as a movement was a failure in its first half which is pre-French Revolution period, because of the fact that the South and the basic population did not give any heed to what the basic Risorgimento was saying. So the next point, which is more important for us, is that when the French Revolution will start within the phase one itself, the Risorgimento will again resurrect itself, become important. But even then, it was not possible to unify Italy because there was no unity generally. And because Italians had no understanding of what it means to be together, the Risorgimento in the first phase itself had two different ways in manifesting itself. In the way of first being under the Tuscany language as a cultural movement, and then during the French Revolution, again coming back, but not successful. Then comes phase two. Phase two is important because on the second phase, what happens is it is under Napoleon that things start to change. And under Napoleon, what happens is that Napoleon, for the first time, gives Italians a feeling of what it means to be united together. Because what Napoleon does is he specifically from five, he brings back into three areas. So now not five powers are controlling Italy, but only three areas. And those three areas are very simple. One directly controlled by France, and two indirectly controlled by his basic deputies, his own family members. And this in turn was very, very important, which we'll talk about the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily. Very, very important because that allowed the Italians for the first time to actually taste what it means to have representative institutions, because representative institutions were introduced by Napoleon himself. And over and above that, he was also very, very important administrative experience and law and order. Basically, what Napoleon did in Germany was to simplify them. Here it was to give them a feeling of what it means to be united. So Napoleon played a very significant role in both the German and Italian unification. And here also he was the one who gave them a very important sense of what it means to be a very important Italian cultural nationalistic sentiment. Now, as we know, 1815, Metternich will technically come back, or technically the Metternich system will be put in place of the Napoleonic order. And what Napoleon had done was three areas, five powers taken away. The Metternich mandate in phase two itself was that you bring back the five powers and restore everybody's privilege again. And this is again a problematic aspect because the people by this point of time knew how to be united, which in turn leads us to phase three. Phase three is important because phase three is where the unification will start to happen. Phase 3 will happen in 1815 itself, because as soon as the Metternich order will come back, there will be a popular reaction. This is a difference between Germany and Italy. In Germany, what happened was that in Germany between 1815 to close to 1862, the Metternich order was more or less stable. However, in 1815 itself, because Risorgimento also saw a resurrection with Napoleon pushing French culture and the basic idea of unity, as soon as Metternich will bring back the five powers, the Italians will reject the restoration, and in turn, under Mazzini and a person called Garibaldi, now the Italians will start their Young Italy movement, which is that we will not go back to the five power formula. We will remain as one united Italy. And now the basic concept of Italy was already there. Mazzini and Garibaldi, radicals, very, very significant in contributing to the Italian unification. But the period between 1815 and 1830 and 1848, in 1830, they will be able to somehow bring back some form of unified Italy concept, but again a major failure because Austria will not allow it. And in 1848 also, Austria will be the same power, which will crush the way they were able to establish even a parallel government in parts of Italy. The point was, Mazzini and Garibaldi were though able to generally have moments in 1830 and 1848, both important revolutions in themselves, 1848 itself. But the problem was that they were not able to unify Italy because the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was too strong and it did not want to give up Venetia or Lombardy or Parma or Modena. And that is the basic point. The point is the democratic attempt was failing. Now comes 1848 and onwards, which is the second part of this third phase itself. Once it was clear that unified Italy cannot be created through the actions of what we call as revolutionaries, the prime minister of the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, a person called Cavour, will now take it upon himself to now unify Italy. And his politics is going to become very, very important because he will first fight in the Crimean War, which we will discuss later. But in the Crimean War, he will try to bring the French and the British together on the concept of unifying Italy. He will not be able to, but he will get French support. He will then fight with Austria and get north of Italy, thereafter get central Italy through plebiscite, and then when Garibaldi will launch a peasant movement in southern Italy, he will then be able to unify Italy itself. Again, it was a person and it was not a democratic movement like Germany. That Cavour and Bismarck are technically architects of Italian and German unification. And this is why the third phase is considered very, very important. So, in the larger story of what we are discussing here, it's very, very easy to understand that unification of Italy and Germany shows us the limitations of democratic people's action in unifying, and it was two people's ambition to make their kingdom bigger and become more strong themselves, which in turn led to what we call as German and Italian unification. So let's do one thing. Let's try to understand this in nuanced manner. Now you have a basic understanding, a long story which you can work with and understand the larger concept of what we call as Italian unification. So as I told you, the Sardinia and Piedmont area was one power. Then you have France, which controls parts of Lombardy. Then you have Austria, which controls mostly Venetia and parts of Parma and Modena. Then you have the papal authority itself. And then you have Spain, which controls most of southern Italy. So basically, there are five different powers which are technically at this point of time ruling the Italian areas. And more than that, North and South Italy was quite starkly different. Most of the important cities were in the north. Southern Italy had mountainous ranges, not very fertile, agrarian, blunder, and disaster was happening at this point of time. So let's understand this in the larger perspective of what we call as Italian unification. And remember, please, for sure, that what we call as Italian unification is three phases. One is called Risorgimento. The other one is called what we call as the second phase is called the concept of what we call as Napoleon and Metternich. And their third phase is nothing but revolutionaries and Cavour. And Cavour by again 1870s will be able to create Italy, but he would have to play a game of chess with the world powers because Napoleon and Metternich are the people who will technically create the context in which Italian nationalism will take its form and become more and more aggressive. Very, very important point in that regard. So, let's talk about Italy in the 19th century. Italy disintegrated after the fall of the Roman Empire. A balance was eventually formed with the states of Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and the Papal States, and all of them having five different basic powers controlling these areas. And this is the whole point that it was Spain, France, Austria, and the Papal Authority, along with what we call as the Piedmont and Sardinia area, that actually they have very, very different but diverse forms of power control. More than that, by 16th century, what we see is that even the British, Swiss, and Germans wanted control over some of the Italian islands. And Bismarck, the Prussian prime minister, even argued that Italy was only a geographical expression, not a cultural one. And this is the whole point that they believed that the Italians were never united. And the basic point was there was in between squabble to divide Italy as much as possible because there was a lot of small islands which they used to control. On the other hand, southern Italy was arid, polarized with absy landlordism, poverty stricken peasantry. So, technically, the landlord peasant structure. More than that, what we see is that low rate of literacy, cultural dominated by religion, and more than that, prevented the growth of a national culture. Basically, north south division in Italy was so pronounced that they could never come together on basic things. So, basically, the natural obstacle is culture initially, and more than that, it's economic because there are two areas, two Italys which exist in that regard. More than that, numerous dialects were technically preventing language from being a unifying factor, which is going to change in phase one itself, where Risorgimento and Alfieri is going to change that. And southern Italy was under the Spanish king, northern Lombardy under Austria. The Pope also had authority over Rome. So basically, all these were pushing Italy apart, and that in turn meant that basic issue is that Italians cannot automatically, naturally unify because of these multiplicity of powers. Over and above that, now the Risorgimento or the phase one of their unification will be very, very important. So now phase one of unification, remember it in this way because it will be easier for you in the exam. In that context, Risorgimento, cultural awakening and a reaction to the dominant French culture which was coming from the north. And Risorgimento will be about how an Italian identity can be created. So Verito Alfieri was a person who called for national unity, and he was the one who is going to use the Tuscany dialect to create a common language for Italians. So the Italian language which we actually listen and write today is actually the Tuscany language. And linguistic nationalism will in turn become cultural nationalism. Remember this because this cultural nationalism will then embody the basic concept of unification. This is very, very important in that regard. Now, basically, phase one is extremely significant because of the fact that it will try to break one barrier, and that barrier was language. Because of multiplicity of dialects, they were not coming together. At least language will now become a unifying feature. But as I told you, the problem with the Risorgimento is limited success because of lack of education. People were not literate enough. An absence of popular support base for national movement, which in turn meant that the people had no idea what was the Risorgimento. This will be a problem with Mazzini also and Garibaldi also. They will never have the base to launch the unification because basically the peasants and the lower section of the society and the lower section of the society will never have any understanding of what these revolutionaries were actually talking about. And this is the basic problem. Then, the next, when the Risorgimento started to die through, the French Revolution was extremely important. With the French occupation and even before that, the rationalist enlightenment ideas reduced the power of the Pope and the Church due to the French Revolution itself. The French Revolution in turn removed the Church's authority over the people to some extent, but it also allowed for the Risorgimento to come back. Artificial movement with no popular base because this Risorgimento was also resurgence, as Risorgimento it is called. Risorgimento was also fake or no popular base. With no popular base, it meant that the real assertion of national identity will come with French occupation under Napoleon. So much like in what is called Germany, Napoleon played an extremely important role in that regard. And it will then be Napoleon who will change everything in phase two itself, which is that Napoleon was the one who technically occupied Italy. He simplified Italy itself, gave him a united experience. More than that, he was also very, very instrumental in agriculture and he started to make the agriculture better. Feudalism was fully abolished, all reminiscence of that. Started to construct roads to facilitate communication. The civil code and the commercial code, which Napoleon brought with himself, now made Italy one administrative unit divided into three parts But basically, the Italians for the first time saw what is called as representative government. What does it mean to be part of the decision making process? So, the representative government, which with the separation of powers leading to people's involvement in decision making, gave Italians a new type of experience and reviewed the territorial boundaries for improving administrative efficiency. This is the whole point. Napoleon, again, was extremely important in administratively unifying this area. So, what we see is that he creates one which is northern Italy, directly annexed by France. The second unit which he created was called the Kingdom of Italy, which is ruled by Napoleon himself, and the southern sector, which is Kingdom of Naples, which is ruled by Napoleon's family. Now, basically, what this allows for, with the Confederation of Rhine already in the north, what it allows for is unified control, separation of power, and basically Italians will also become more and more aggressive about their identity, because what France will do or what Napoleon will do is try to push French culture on them. And basically, this Kingdom of Italy and Kingdom of Naples became the basic rudimentary form of Italy, which becomes the base for unification. Unification. This is very, very important. Now, basically, this experience was very, very important for the Italians, because now when the Metternich order will come, they will not go back. So, basically, within the phase two itself, once the Congress of Vienna will come through, this three system of Italy, Kingdom of Italy, and Kingdom of Naples, this system will be removed, and the old system of five powers will be brought back. But the difference between Germany and Italy is that in Germany, they technically accepted the Metternich order. On the other hand, in Italy, they fully rejected the concept. They really rejected the concept, which in turn led to what we call as the fact that they wanted to divide Italy in the same way it was already there. The point was that Metternich system of 1815 was aimed at keeping Italy divided to maintain the balance of power in Europe. Metternich sought to expel all ideas of liberalism, reformism, nationalism from the peninsula, rise of spirit of Risorgimento, and counter-conservative consolidation. This means that what Metternich brought with himself was the conservative social order of what we call as the five power system. But the Italians now had Risorgimento back, and the counter conservative forces, specifically the radicals, will now fully reject this concept and say enough is enough. We want Italy together. So the reaction was in two different ways. The moderates, who believed in the Confederation to be a confederation of Italian states, achieved only through an association and a constitutional monarchy. On the other hand, the radicals with Mazzini Garibaldi there wanted a Italian republic with through popular insurrection. Insurrection means when you rise against the government. So basically, they wanted to challenge the Metternich conservatism, and Mazzini put forward the Italian revolutionary program, a step-by-step program in which he would be able to challenge the Metternich order and then establish Italy. And this is the difference between Italy and Germany. Please understand this. I will give you a summary in the end. You will understand also. In Germany, the Metternich order was very quickly accepted. But in Italy, it wasn't. There was a lot of resistance to the conservative Metternich order as soon as we talk about the coming back of the 1815 Congress of Vienna. So, the importance of Mazzini is that he will now introduce a lot of important concepts, which will be the base on which the Italians will fight for their unification. So he argued, and very philosophically, very importantly argued, the nation has its own mission to be fulfilled by the discovery of its own aptitudes and interests. So basically, every nation has its own aptitude, its own aspirations. Rejecting the existing federalism in Italy, denouncing it as a device of prolonging the hegemony of the ruling class, what he argued was that this five power system was technically only complicating things, and it was all about making sure that the people remain divided And if they remain divided, what happens is that Italy does not unite. So it was about bringing this whole concept of people under one belt, under one roof, as Italy needed this divisive policy of dividing into five powers. This federalism was very, very important and it needed to be removed. He further argued that the idea of an indivisible sovereign Italy with a sense of national consciousness through the participation of people was now very, very important and dominant. They wanted an Italy which was free, which was sovereign, which was not controlled by five powers. It was controlled by Italians themselves, which was again very, very important. Needed the participation of the peasantry, but students and middle class were the only main supporters. Again, the problem is limited base. The national consciousness was still fragmented. And if it is fragmented, it is based on the fragmented mentality of Mazzini. Mazzini was able to become very, 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 very popular in students. He was even read by Bhagat Singh in India. The problem was that he was still not reaching out to the peasantry, and because most of them were not literate, they were not able to understand what Mazzini is actually saying. But Mazzini is going to become very, very important in that regard. He will then found Young Italy in 1831 itself, aimed at ending Austrian domination in Italy. That was a basic point. Austria controlled a major chunk of Italy in the north, which was about the most important area which they wanted from Austria, creating a strong republican Italy through armed insurrection. So what he chose was not moderate method, but what he chose was the extremist method of using violence against the state, which was again equally important. And the literary dimensions to this nationalism was given through the societies and journals. So they kept on producing revolutionary literature, even poems, books were produced. So it was proper nationalist movement. But the point was that the basic point was we will use force to remove the Metternich order and these five orders. Then Mazzini used even theater, music, which technically was now reflecting anti-French and anti-Austrian themes. So the basic folklore, the basic cultural forms, and the art forms, technically all of them were now based on Mazzini's understanding of how do we become together, and it was about creating an anti-French, anti-Austrian attitude. Paintings depicted battles with victories of Italians. Poetry glorified liberty, justice, and denounced tyranny. So the French Revolution had now become an infection. Fact is that freedom, liberty, and the fact that representation was something which was already in the part or already a part of the vocabulary of the world is very, very important in that regard. Further, what we see is that in 1830, Mazzini will be able to technically carve out power but not hold on to it. In the July Revolution in France, which led to the nationalist tendencies in Italy, the insurrection against papal churches was there. In Modena, there were major leads through which the July monarchy was installed by the people. So the people did install their own government, but Austria crushed the revolution very, very hard, and the revolt was crushed by Austria. France failed to help against the Austrians, and this increased the hatred against Austrians more than the French. The basic point is the revolution of 1830 is very, very important because here the people were able to remove the papal authority, and in the areas of Modena, the basic point was that a monarchy was established with the people's understanding but failed because of Austria's aggression. On the other hand, what we see is during 1848, the revolution, there's also something which is going to happen in Italy. That this year there was revolutions throughout Europe, we already know that. And this encouraged revolutions in Italy also. The Pope granted constitution to the papal states in 1848, which led to other demands also asking for it. So it was about giving a constitution, a written document which could talk about power itself. Full scale revolt and what are called revolutionary tendencies broke out in Italy. However, it was a movement which was too distracted. It had too many aims. Democratic movement led to movement towards unification, but the basic failure was that it had too many leaders. No real goal was there. So basically, confusion of aims. Kind of government, role of Pope, nobody knew. Why was the Pope doing it? Nobody knew. What kind of government do they want? Is it a monarchy, or is it a constitutional monarchy, or is it a republic? The point was that they were fully confused. Lack of effective leadership. Mazzini and Garibaldi were able to give it, but not around what are called the papal areas. Lack of coordination among leaders themselves. French and Austrians again intervened because the French were going to lose the most, and Austria the biggest area if they actually, specifically Venetia, which is a very, very prosperous sector. Pope's refusal to support the revolution in the larger context, only giving this 1848 constitution, that's it. Lack of popular involvement except by the middle classes. Again, the basic point was peasantry and common people were again absent from this story. And that is the basic point. The people were not coming together as a whole itself. Then comes phase 3. And this is about Cavor's politics. And we've seen between 1830 1848, which is again common to Germany, democratic attempts were unsuccessful. Basically, what was now clear was only diplomacy and war could bring Italy together. And this is the whole point. So, with Napoleon III rising by 1853, the Metternich order was something which was technically against his own uncle, so he hated the Metternich order. So he allowed for liberal nationalistic movements to rise in the areas which were still erstwhile controlled by France or were under French influence. So he supported nationalist and liberal movements to undo the settlement of Vienna, which was to undo what Metternich had done. And this is the basic hatred with Metternich itself. And the British politicians favored the development of nationalism in Central Europe if it could now curb the power of Austria and Russia. But right now, the biggest villain is Austria, where everybody is going to support whenever Austrian power is taken away. Later, it will become Russia, and later, it will become Germany. The three basic villains of what we call as Europe. So, it is in this context that Napoleon III wanted to overthrow the basic order of Metternich. And the basic point is the revolutionary action is going in the background. That the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, it started to rise. It occupied the area of Genoa, became a small naval power, promulgated a liberal constitution, started to modernize itself also. And the point was that Cavour, who was the prime minister of Piedmont, now will contribute to this process, and he will become the architect of what we call as the unification of Italy, because he will have the basic skill set to unify Italy. And that is the whole point. Italy could only be united if this only Italian sector could move towards the south and capture power. But the problem is this area which is under Austria. So now Cavour starts to do what technically Bismarck did for Germany. He started to modernize the army. He also modernized the credit and banking system so that he was internally very strong, developed modern means of communication, encouraged foreign investment into Piedmont, and also reduced the church privileges. So technically, he introduced democratic means, and more than that, he started the age of modernization, which was important to win wars. And then use realpolitik in international relations, which is to believe that we be rational and opportunist, which is realpolitik, which is he will start to now technically influence or try to influence the French and the British. And that he will do through what is called the Crimean War and thereafter. So basically, now the game of chess starts. How Cavour is going to control this whole agenda. So, what Cavour actually did was the Crimean War, which is happening in 1853. Remember, we'll talk about Crimean War in a lot of detail when we'll talk about the Eastern Question, which is the fifth unit. The point is that in 1853, Russia was fighting with Britain and France, and we'll talk about why later, but basically, this is the context of the Crimean War. Once Cavour got to know that the British and the French will win, he started to support the British and the French by giving his modern army to them in order to get his favor. He knew that the Russian would lose, and once the Russians would lose, the Congress or some form of treaty will happen at Paris, and he wanted to be there as a stakeholder. So what he did was, in the Crimean War, he started to support the British and the French, and this was to actually get or gain access to the Congress of Paris, which was going to happen once the Russian defeat was going to come. And the basic point was that there he would use his influence, his power, to then talk about unification and get the support of either the British or the French or both. But the point was, though he did get access to the Congress of Paris only as a subordinate ally, he was not able to push for the unification. The point was, he used to argue that he was the only man who could actually control the unification process. What he argued was that Italy is going to be the next place where the French Revolution is going to happen. And to the people, he used to say that I am the only person who can unify Italy. To the great powers, he used to say that Italy is on a boiling point. It will burst. We need to do something. So basically, subordinate ally, it was given a basic concept of being there, but nothing they were able to push. So now Cavour, what he did was, he then turned towards the British. The British said that we have nothing to do with Italian unification. So then he turned towards the French. And it is only Napoleon III who will then come to the aid of the Italians. So in July of 1858, a treaty was signed between France and Piedmont, in which Austria will be attacked by Piedmont, thereby provoking Austria to a war, and France will then come to Piedmont's assistance. Though there were a lot of hiccups in this, because initially France will not respond, but it will later. The basic point was that Piedmont will then fight a war with Austria, in which France will help win the war against Austria, and eventually Piedmont will gain access to Lombardy, Venetia, and parts of the Papal States, and France will get Nice and Savoy. And this was the payment for this assistance, that we will give only assistance if you give us Nice and Savoy. So basically, Nice and Savoy are two very important areas which were given to France. In return for that, Italy northern sector was somehow and more or less unified. Now, after the unification of northern Italy, Cavour agreed to hand over Nice and Savoy to the French if she agreed to allow the union of Parma, Modena, and Tuscany. So the other way around was that we are giving you Nice and Savoy as payment for your neutrality and helping us against Austria. But the basic point was that they also said that we will only give you these territories properly if you allow us to now unify northern Italy. And that was a very important point which was there. So once northern Italy was done with the French understanding, the central Italy area will come through plebiscite, in which central Italy voted almost unanimously in favor of joining the union under Piedmont. So now north is there, central is there. Now what is left is technically southern sector. Southern sector is a different story, where Garibaldi is going to start a peasant movement. He will then be able to overthrow the power, and then he will give the power to Cavour, because Cavour will become very, very tense that what if the movement goes out of hand. So basically, the peasant revolt in southern Italy was started against the King of Naples by Garibaldi, who will then liberate Sicily. Cavour, fearing the revolutionary forces, marched his army to south, with the French consent annexed a part of the Papal States and joined Garibaldi. So he was able to take all three sectors, north, central, and south. But the basic point was, he will wait till 1870s. Once the French will become weak after Napoleon III will be removed, and the French will technically be defeated by Bismarck, he will then take the papal church authority away, because the French were technically the saviors or the protectors of the papal authority. So once the French will be defeated by Bismarck, he will take Bismarck's permission to take the area of Venetia. So finally, Venetia will be taken by Italy in 1866, Rome in 1870 on account and an alliance with Bismarck, and by 1871, whole of Italy was unified. So basically, see, Savoy was given to France, Nice was given to France, but Piedmont was able to first consolidate this area, first phase, but Venetia was left. Then they were able to take this area through the plebiscite. Then they were able to take this through Garibaldi's action of what we call as peasant revolt. But the point was that he needed to take Venetia, which he will take with the permission of Bismarck, and then take the papal authority and just reduce it to the Vatican by the authority of, once Bismarck will defeat the French in 1871, and that will in turn allow the Italians to actually come together and take this area which was there. Now, the Italians still had a lot of issues, which is that cultural and linguistic barriers will still remain. Most of the people will still very loyal to the local powers, and resistance against Sardinia and Piedmont was also there. Lack of efficient law and order was also a consequence, and the Pope opposed most of the states, so there was no church authority. But basically, the people's will of unifying was done. Cavour was able to, in a way, overcome all these challenges in a period of time. But Italian unification was a little bit prolonged and much more complicated than the German ones because it had to happen in phases. So, one thing is very clear before we talk about this basic summary of Italy, which is Risorgimento, role of Alfieri, rise of what we call as Italian nationalism during French rule and the French Revolution itself. Second being Metternich and rise of Mazzini, and third being Napoleon III and rise of Piedmont and role of Cavour. There are actually intersections between the Italian and the German story. If you look at it in both Napoleon, Revolution of 1848, and Metternich, all three were actually important. In the basic story, in the German story or the Italian story, the same story is there. In all three were crucial. So let's do one thing. Let's try to plot this on a basic timeline based understanding. This will give you a basic understanding of what we mean as unification of Germany and Italy, and it will allow us to also understand these two events together. So basically, what we see is that we have Germany and we have Italy. And what we see very simply is we start our story in 1800, and what we will do is 1806, 1815, 1848, 1862, 1866, 1871. And the Italian story will technically be 1800, 1815, 1830 here, 1848, 1853, 1860s, and 1871. And the basic story is what is intersecting here is the 1815 sector, which is Napoleon, and this in turn was a very important intersection. On the other, the next intersection is at the revolution of 1848. So let's try to do one thing. Let's try to understand what this means. This period is under the Holy Roman Empire. Thereafter, they will go under Napoleon. And this period is called the Confederation of Rhine. Thereafter, between 1815 and 1848, we have what is called the Metternich Order, and this is called the German Confederation. On the other hand, in 1848, there's a rejection, and that rejection is going to be important in what we call as the Frankfurt Parliament. But the basic Confederation of Rhine will be there here. In this period itself, we have Zollverein, which will be in action, and the basic rivalry between Austria and Prussia. 1862, rise of Bismarck, and Bismarck will then start to play his politics. 66, they will fight with Austria, and 71, they will fight with France, and they will technically unify. This is the basic story. On the other hand, before 1850 itself, we have the Risorgimento in Italy. During the basic occupation of what we call as Napoleonic occupation, the Italian cultural nationalism became very, very important under Napoleon. And thereafter, between 1815 to 1848, rather than accepting the Metternich order, rejection of Metternich order, and what we see is the rise of Mazzini and Garibaldi. And in 1848, there's a major moment in which they try to capture power, but not successful. And what happens is that in 1853, and in between this period, we see the rise of a very important personality, which is rise of Cavour. And Cavour will then use the Crimean War as a way of getting some concessions. And between 1853 and 1871, he will fight with Austria, then have the plebiscite in what we call as Central Italy, and third, he will finally get it from Bismarck, the area of Venetia, thereby consolidating Italy in 1871. This is how these two stories are stacked up. Generally, this area is very, very important because it can come in the exam as a concept of what we call as the basic story. What a question will come will be about Bismarck and Cavour. What type of role did they play? And basically, how did Napoleon also influence their unification? Napoleon was very important because in Germany he was able to first 314 to 39, and on the other hand, in the context of Italy, he was able to give them some form of administrative unification, which became a very important experience for them. Now, what you will do when it comes to phases, that type of question you have to keep it simple in 250 words or 150 words and just give them basic keywords, risorgimento, Mazzini, Garibaldi. So you can't go into micro histories. There's a lot of history which is still embedded. I've given you a simplified story. You don't have to go into that much detail. Now, some questions for your practice from this theme itself. So basically, discuss the forces behind the unification of Germany and its long-term impact on global politics. Forces would be, you will talk about Napoleon, how he was a very important force. Then you're going to talk about Prussian and Austrian rivalry, that you're going to talk about. Then you're going to talk about Zollverein. Then you're going to talk about Bismarck, which is going to be the major chunk of the answer. And impact, as I told you, rise of a very important power. And we'll actually see, you will be able to answer this question. You'll be able to answer this question better once you've already done First World War and Second World War. So one more question for you very easily. Cavour was the architect of modern Italy. Discuss in the context of unification of Italy. Basically, you have to talk about the politics of Cavour, what he did in the Crimean War, what he did with regards to Napoleon the Third, and how he was able to first take northern, then central, and then southern Italy. At the same time, another question, critically examine the blood and iron policy of Bismarck, basically to talk about how the Frankfurt Parliament will fail in the first part of the question, and then talk about how blood and iron meant first military and then both diplomatic. And this question is technically talking about how he played the chess, how he helped the Russians in the Polish context, convince the French and the British, and then how he went for war with both and then went with war with France also. So with this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope now unification of Italy and Germany is clear. One of the most complex parts of the syllabus itself. Hereafter, the story becomes easier and much more enjoyable and interesting because of the fact that we will be now going towards the Industrial Revolution, thereafter the Eastern question and the road to the First World War. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next video. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.